This is the forgotten video game masterpieces Iceberg. It begins with a lot of cult classic video games, some of which you may be familiar with, but as we get lower on this iceberg, the games are going to get increasingly more obscure and in many ways are weird sort of in their design and concept. Now, very intentionally, this iceberg is a lot more trimmed back in terms of the number of entries on it, especially when compared to the previous two that I've done. This will just allow me to go into a bit more depth on each topic and provide, hopefully, some level of nuance instead of just like rushing through everything. And in saying that, this iceberg is by no means a completely comprehensive look at forgotten video game masterpieces, but really just like a window onto the topic. I upload videos monthly, give or take a week or so, and I have a lot of stuff on the way that I personally think is very exciting. So if this is content that you're into, consider subscribing so you don't miss a new video when I drop it. I'll provide links to any of the gameplay footage that I do use in this video, along with the references in the description. And yeah, with all of that out of the way, let's get into layer one of this iceberg, the forgotten classics. Beyond Good and Evil is a Ubisoft title released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, the GameCube, and eventually the PC. It was designed by French game designer Michel Ancel, who is also known for being the creator of the Rayman series of platformer games. It's a third-person action-adventure game and is pretty well regarded for being one of the few games from that era to take the Zelda formula, so the semi-open world, the side quests, the puzzles, the stealth, the light combat, etc., and not only make it all work, but actually make it feel fresh and unique. And that's in large part due to its unique and very cool sci-fi aesthetic and the world of Hillis in which the game is set. Another game comparison that keeps popping into my head is Jak 3, which would have been cool to talk about, but let's be honest, we haven't forgotten about Jak 3. The story of Beyond Good and Evil is set on the mining planet of Hillis in the year of 2435, and you play as Jade, who is a young photojournalist as she begins to unravel this very deep-rooted conspiracy that involves the planet's supposed protectors, the Alpha Sections, and an alien threat known as Dom Z. And in her quest, she is aided by resistance fighters and her uncle Paige, who has a very cool character design. He's a boar, but he stands on two legs, and he wears a singlet and like a jacket, and overall, he's just a very cool dude. And these companions, whether it's Uncle Paige or if it's somebody else, are actually helpful in assisting you with the gameplay, which for 2003 was pretty impressive, and the critics took notice of this, because back then, most of the time NPCs were pretty undercooked and would just sort of get in the way of what you were trying to do. In regards to gameplay, Jade's main kit includes a camera, a staff, and a disc launcher. Now, the staff is used for any sort of close quarters combat, and the disc launcher provides ranged attacks and opens up different options with how you approach situations and sort of goes hand in hand with the stealth mechanics. And in terms of the camera, this game has a unique photography system. So firstly, it's used to take photos of evidence, which is then used to progress the storyline. But the second thing that you can do is document the planet's wildlife, which you can then exchange for currency such as pearls and credits. And it's just a nice way to incentivize players to explore the world of Hillis. Upon release, the game was met with positive reviews, citing everything from the gameplay and the graphics to the world of Hillis and even the OST. If you feel like shedding some tears, go and check out Home Sweet Home and thoughtful reflections from this soundtrack. And despite being in contention for Game of the Year awards and actually winning Best Adventure Game of 2003 from IGN, commercially, Beyond Good and Evil flopped pretty hard. And apparently after Christmas, some retailers dropped the price of the game by up to 80%. Now, the game director himself believed that Beyond Good and Evil didn't perform well because it wasn't an already established IP, and therefore there just wasn't an audience for it. And while this is definitely a factor, let's not forget that Ubisoft pretty much neglected this game from the moment it was released. And this is a theme that's going to continue to pop up in this iceberg, but because Ubisoft weren't sure like how to market the video game, they just didn't really even try to. On top of this, and this is really the nail in the coffin, they released Beyond Good and Evil just 2 weeks apart from their other major tentpole release, which was also an action-adventure game in the same genre, also received really good reviews, but this game was based on an established IP, and that was Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. And that game sold really, really well. So not only did they not market Beyond Good and Evil, but they actively crippled its sales by releasing it right next to Prince of Persia. And so, yeah, the fate of Beyond Good and Evil was the bargain bin of pretty much every retailer the following year. Thankfully, in the subsequent years, its status has grown. Destructoid ranked it the 6th best game of the decade. Game Radar ranked it the 70th best game of all time, just straight up. And in 2010, IGN put it at number 34 on their list of the top 100 PS2 games of all time. And for the people who grew up playing this game, they have a lot of fond memories and nostalgia for it. Let me show you some comments that I found. I replayed it 2 days ago with a mod that allowed me to play it with high res and better textures and all, and I swear, I legit cried. Mega Bahamut 123, I hope you're okay. I played this game a million times and I still like it. A million. I recently played this game for the first time and finished it not knowing what it was about, and God, I can't explain how good this game is. How it made me feel like I had a safe place and a real break on life. I wish games would be this good and passionate these days. This is how I feel about The Simpsons Hit and Run. Final thing I want to talk about is Beyond Good and Evil 2. Now, people talk about games getting stuck in development hell. This is the level beyond that. This is like development purgatory. In 2008, Beyond Good and Evil was announced with a teaser trailer. And then in 2009, a second trailer was leaked. And it was all very exciting. And then fans waited for years and years and years and years until eventually in 2017 at E3, the game was announced for a second time with a trailer, except this time, the game was now going to be a prequel, and the gameplay had changed significantly. And there is gameplay footage of this build, and there is a video with Ansel going through it. And it does look pretty cool. It's definitely going for that No Man's Sky thing with seamless transitions between planets. In 2020, Ansel, who was the game director, left Ubisoft following some allegations. And then in 2022, it surpassed Duke Nukem Forever for the longest development time on a video game ever. And then sadly, in 2023, the creative director for the game died suddenly at the age of 40. So yeah, the future for this sequel looks pretty bleak. However, I do have some good news, because recently a 20-year anniversary remake for the original Beyond Good and Evil was leaked on the Xbox Store. And it is real, and it is supposed to be getting a release date at some point early this year. Let's go. Ooh, oops. Okami was released in 2006 and was developed by Clover Studios and published by Capcom exclusively for the PlayStation 2. And similar to Beyond Good and Evil, it's also an action-adventure game and is also drawing a lot of inspiration from the Zelda series. And in saying that, I don't want to diminish Okami in any way, because it brings a lot of original ideas to the table and it really is its own beast. Firstly, the story of the game is inspired by Japanese folklore, and a lot of the characters are based on the Shinto religion. For example, you play as Amaterasu, who is actually the Shinto sun goddess who has taken on the form of a wolf in an attempt to save Nippon, which is the fictionalized realization of Japan in Okami. And then there's the wholly unique art style, which is inspired by traditional Chinese inkbrush painting and rendered in the form of cel-shaded graphics, which at the time of its release, and even 2 decades later, still really stands out. Interestingly, the original vision for the game was the exact opposite. The devs wanted to do something very realistic and simulation-like, but upon realizing the hardware limitations of the PlayStation 2, they switched to something more abstract and achievable. And this is one of those examples of constraints breeding creativity, and Okami is all the better for it. And thematically, the art style actually bleeds into the gameplay in the form of the Celestial Brush, which, while it is very unique, is a core gameplay mechanic where essentially the game will freeze time while you use either the left analog stick or the Wii remote on the Wii version to draw shapes at the top of the screen, which will then result in a corresponding effect. And this is important when solving puzzles, but it's also useful in combat too. So for example, if you draw a loop, that'll result in a strong wind that you can use against your enemies. So the rest of the gameplay is primarily linear and set in a semi-open world as you control Amaterasu as you explore, battle, and engage in quests. So It's definitely giving Zelda. Upon its release, Okami was met with near universal acclaim. Behold these review scores. And like I said in the intro, Okami literally won Game of the Year for 2006 from IGN. And I'm gonna pull out the list of all other winners of this award. And you can see, like, it does really stand out. But despite all of this praise, Okami performed very poorly commercially. And in 2007, a year after its release, it had only managed to sell 270,000 copies. And then in 2008, two things would happen. One, Clover Studios was dissolved. And secondly, WiiPort. And although the Wii version was a bit more successful and managed to bolster the sales up to 600,000 copies by 2009, it could not save Okami from receiving the Guinness Book of World Record for the least commercially successful winner of a Game of the Year award. But it also won the award for the most critically acclaimed video game starring an animal character. So perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons why Okami didn't sell super well in its initial release, but what I think is probably most important is the fact that Okami was released towards the end of the PS2's life cycle. Because in the subsequent years, with the release of Okami HD for the PS4, Xbox One, and the Switch, the game has sold considerably well, and as of 2023, it has sold 4 million copies, and it's also on Steam, and it's really not that expensive. I think it's like $10 or something. It's very accessible and pretty easy to get your hands on, which is not something that can be said for some of the other games further down in this iceberg. And with that, let's transition. Ico was released in 2001 exclusively for the PlayStation 2, and it is once again another action-adventure game. It was developed by Japan Studio in conjunction with Team Ico, who were the devs behind a game that many people consider to just be the greatest PS2 game of all time, and that would be 2005's Shadow of the Colossus. And in Ico, it's pretty easy to see sort of the foundations for the gameplay that would become Shadow of the Colossus. In the game, you play as a young boy named Ico, who has been ostracized from his community because he was born with horns on his head, locked in a coffin, and abandoned in a castle, which really sucks. After escaping from this coffin, you soon meet Yorda, who turns out to be the daughter of the queen of this castle, and she also finds herself in a predicament. She's being held there captive by her mother, who has some pretty awful plans for her. And so the premise of the game is that Ico and Yorda are working together to escape from this castle, platforming, solving puzzles, and sometimes using a stick to fight shadow creatures. No joke. And the thing with Yorda is that her movement is very limited, but you need her with you to open up certain areas to progress through the game. So a lot of the gameplay is trying to help Yorda cross obstacles by either like lifting her up or manipulating the environment around her. The gameplay is very purposely stripped back, and that's because it was the vision of game director Fumita Ueda to create a minimalist game about boy meets girl. And unique to this point is the fact that this game does not feature a HUD, as this would break the immersion of the world that Ueda was trying to facilitate. For example, Ico is running across a bridge, but instead of just having the camera follow from behind him, the camera is actually in front of him. And as he gets to the middle of the bridge, the camera pans around this way, revealing a really beautiful vista. And the net result of this is that even the small moments feel crafted, and you can feel the intention behind it. Upon release, Ico was met with near universal acclaim. And the sentiment that I saw echoed across different reviews was that Ico is a game more than the sum of its parts. For example, if you just take the combat system at face value, well, it's very rudimentary and it probably won't satisfy you if that's all you're looking for. But if you stand back and take in the overwhelming attention to details, the visuals, the animations, the environments, those little moments I was talking about, it all results in this very distinct and impactful experience. And similar to Okami, Ico is one of the video games that is generally cited when people try to make the case that video games can be works of art. At awards time, the game was heavily represented, and in the years since, it has only grown in estimation, and it would go on to have an influence on an oodle of things, including the movie mind of film director Guillermo del Toro and video game series such as Dark Souls and Uncharted. This is one of those weird tidbits that I always find very interesting, but apparently this was Johnny Greenwood's favorite video game, or at least it was at the time of a Radiohead blog post, which is now no longer available, unfortunately. But no amount of praise, and not even Johnny Greenwood, could save this game commercially, because after 8 years of release, it had struggled to sell just over 700,000 copies and was considered a commercial failure. And there's a bunch of contributing factors to its poor sales, and I can pretty much just list off what I said for BGE and Okami. Unique concept, hard to market, therefore didn't receive much marketing. But I do want to highlight one thing, and that is the cover art. This is what happens when you let corporate bodies use market testing to make decisions and override an artistic vision. Now, this cover art here, which I'm also going to put here for now, I'm going to blow it up. This is the Japanese cover art. And look, it's just my opinion, but I think this looks really awesome. It's super iconic. I've seen this cover art throughout my life, and it's one of those like images that lives rent-free in my brain. And what's even cooler about this is that it was painted by the game director himself, Fumito Ueda, and is based on the work of Italian painter Giorgio de Chirico. Now, this is the American cover art. And in the words of chess grandmaster Hans Niemann, the cover art speaks for itself. Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines was developed by Trokia Games and was released in 2004 for the PC. And the video game is actually adapted from a tabletop RPG called Vampire: The Masquerade from 1991. The game itself is set in a modern Los Angeles and unfolds between 4 main districts. You've got Santa Monica, Downtown, Chinatown, and of course, Hollywood. The majority of the gameplay is from the first person perspective. So if you're interacting, exploring, or any range combat, that's all first person. But very unique to this game is that when you engage in melee combat, the camera shifts to a third-person perspective, which is not what you would normally expect. There's also a stealth system and obviously skill trees and all of the RPG tropes, but something very specific to Bloodlines is the blood system itself, in which blood is a currency needed to activate abilities and disciplines, and you can source blood from different places, such as rodents or blood banks or humans, and the quality of the blood that you get is dependent on where you source it from. And all of this is built upon the Source engine, which is the same engine that runs Half-Life 2 and Counter-Strike. And it's one of the reasons why this game still holds up really well today. At the start of the game, your character is unexpectedly turned into a vampire and very quickly cast into the seedy underworld of vampires and mythical creatures. And once you get there, you have to choose from one of 7 distinct vampire clans to align yourself with. And this is one of the fun aspects of the game that lends itself to multiple replays, because depending on the clan that you align yourself with, it highly affects your playthrough, everything from dialogue trees to gameplay. For example, if you choose to be a Nosferatu, you can't be seen in public because you can't blend in. And so instead of traveling in the streets, most of your travel in the game will be spent in the sewers. And while it's not necessarily the right choice for your first playthrough, it is definitely a choice. The consensus in the community seems to be that the Malkavians are like the coolest and most unique class to play through. And this is in part due to the fact that they are insane. And so as a Malkavian, you hear these guiding voices, which highly influence the way that you approach the game and can lead to some like really ridiculous situations, such as talking to inanimate objects. That being said, you're not meant to play as them on your first playthrough. And even though this is a video game about the dark underworld of vampires, most of the writing in this game is really funny and really goofy. A lot of the characters and lines of dialogue are off the Richter scale. Now, the game had a very turbulent development period, and due to Activision pushing the release, when the game did drop, it dropped with a lot of bugs and was in many ways unfinished. And so if you do download this game today, it's generally recommended that you also install one of the fan-made patches, which is so cool and just demonstrates how passionate this community is that they still continues to support this game even today. Upon release, the game was reviewed positively. I'll put the reviews here. And GameSpy called it a, quote, nearly flawless classic role-playing game. And unfortunately for Bloodlines, a lot of the awards categories that it was competing in that year, it would be pitted against 2 of the greatest gaming sequels of all time, Half-Life 2 and Halo 2. So suffice to say, it didn't really clean up any awards. In its initial release, the game only managed to sell 70,000 copies, and it performed so badly that it led to a lot of the dev team getting laid off, until eventually in 2005, Trokia Games went defunct. And this game really is a true cult classic. So much so that we're getting a sequel. And this wasn't intentional, but I couldn't have timed this video any better because apparently it's coming out this year in 2024. It's being developed by Paradox Interactive, the same people behind Cities Skylines, and there are some gameplay trailers out. Looks super cool, and with that is layer 1 done and dusted. Now we descend into layer 2. Conker's Bad Fur Day is a platformer released in 2001 and developed for the Nintendo 64. It was developed by Rare, who are more recently known for being the people behind Sea of Thieves. However, in the 90s and the early 2000s, they were also responsible for Banjo-Kazooie and the Donkey Kong series. So these family-friendly platformers with mascot characters was like their bread and butter, and they knew how to put together one of these games really well. So originally, Conker's Bad Fur Day was conceived as a sequel to Conker's Pocket Tales, which was a family-friendly adventure game for the Game Boy Color. But at some point during the development for this Conker sequel, Rare realized that the market for these Mario 64 style platformers had become oversaturated. And this became highlighted even more so by the success of their previous game, Banjo-Kazooie. And so the development on this Conker sequel came to a halt. It became apparent that something needed to change. And that change would come when Chris Seavor, who was an artist working on the game, pitched to the higher-ups at Rare that, hey, what if we push the game in an edgy direction, include adult themes, and target an older audience? But because we're already into the development, let's just keep the same assets and maintain the family-friendly cartoon aesthetic. To which the higher-ups at Rare were like. And so Chris Seavor was promoted to the game director, and development continued with this new vision in mind. And it's important to note that Nintendo didn't dabble in mature exclusives for their consoles. And so not only was this a gamble, but this was completely unprecedented. The game follows Conker, who Wikipedia describes as a greedy, hard-drinking red squirrel who must return home to his girlfriend after a night of binge drinking. And the game really leans into all of its eccentricities. You've got cartoon characters smoking tobacco, swearing, graphic violence, breaks in the fourth wall, and a ton of really cool pop culture references. And this relates back to the weird cult movie Iceberg, in which I mentioned that in A Clockwork Orange, the Corova milk bar scene has sort of entered the cultural lexicon. Well, look at how this video game starts. It's the Corova milk bar, but with Conker. It's so cool. And this is just one of a myriad of references that would have made the 2000s college student demographic that this game was targeting do the Leo meme too. The gameplay itself is largely platform based as you work through these enclosed levels and complete objectives. There's also elements of puzzle solving and racing and ranged combat. And this is broken up with several boss fights, such as the mighty Pooh, who lives in Pooh Mountain and sings opera. The release of the game saw overwhelming critical acclaim, with praise being directed not only at the humor and the jokes, but also the graphics and the gameplay. I'll put the review scores here somewhere, and as you can see, lots and lots of yellow. The sales numbers, on the other hand, were not so positive, and in its first month of release, the game had only managed to sell 55,000 copies. And in Europe, the game had to be published by THQ because Nintendo just wasn't vibing it. There are a bunch of contributing reasons for why the game didn't sell well. First being that, like I said, Nintendo just wasn't loving the vibe of the game, and so they distanced themselves from the marketing. Also, this game was just way more expensive than other N64 games, owing to the fact that it had to be stored on a larger 64 megabyte cartridge. The typical size was 32 megabytes, and only 2 other games ever in the history of the N64 use the 64 megabyte cartridge, that being Res Evil 2 and Pokemon Stadium. And then just the fact that the game was released towards the end of the N64's life cycle, at a time when the console was nearly financially dead. These are also all reasons why today the game is pretty darn rare and one of the most expensive games that you can buy for the N64. I'll put some listings up here, but yeah, it demands a premium price tag. And then in 2005, Conker Live and Reloaded was released exclusively for the original Xbox. And essentially, this is just a remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day, but with updated graphics, which I think is really interesting because I didn't know they were remaking games as long ago as like 2005 with hardware like the original Xbox. And despite some of the censorship that people generally complain about in this version, it really does benefit from the updated graphics as well as the inclusion of multiplayer with modes such as Team Deathmatch and Capture the Flag. I remember it just like it was yesterday. Local multiplayer, split screen. Jet Set Radio Future was released in 2002 and is an action game developed exclusively for the Xbox. Not sure if anybody else remembers, but the original Xbox used to come bundled with 2 video games, and one of the more popular bundles included Jet Set Radio Future. So for a lot of people, this was like their first Xbox game. Now, Jet Set Radio Future is notable for many reasons. It had this really unique art style that, along with the first Jet Set game, helped to pioneer cell shading. It also had a cool blend of hip hop and skate culture, and gameplay that was heavily inspired by the Tony Hawk series, which can only ever be a good thing. Now, to understand Jet Set Radio Future fully, we need to wind the clock back 2 years and look at its predecessor, Jet Set Radio, which was released exclusively for the Sega Dreamcast. Now, the Sega Dreamcast was sort of like Sega's last hurrah as a console manufacturer, because in the mid to late 90s, Sega was in some really tough competition with Nintendo, and in particular, Sony and the PlayStation. And so with the Sega Dreamcast, they went all in, and part of that commitment was to produce brand new video game franchises, and this would result in stuff like Crazy Taxi and Jet Set Radio. However, this would not be enough to save the Sega Dreamcast from its inevitable demise. And in 2001, after discontinuing the Dreamcast, Sega partnered with Microsoft to release some of their video game properties exclusively for the Xbox. And so this kicked off the development of Jet Set Radio Future. Now, Future isn't necessarily a sequel to the first Jet Set, but nor is it a remake. It's sort of somewhere in the middle, sort of like a remix or a reimagining. So it takes the original Jet Set, pushes the art style further, tightens up a lot of the gameplay that people felt was clunky, and shifts to a more open-ended approach to gameplay. You play as one of a cast of inline skaters who make up a gang known as the GGs, and much like Tony Hawk, you can grind, you can pull off tricks midair, and you can quickly traverse the map using your skates. There's also a graffiti mechanic, races, trick contests, and all of this takes place in these open world stages with no time limit. And so you're just sort of free to work your way through the objectives at your own pace. It's a very 2000s like level design that you don't see much anymore, and just talking about it makes me want to play either this or Pro Skater, or Underground, or American Wasteland. I'll take any of them. Now, the characters and the world of Tokyo, which is just futuristic Tokyo, are very cool in the way that they are realized using cel shaded graphics, but also the color palette is really sweet. And it reminds me so much of Invader Zim, which was also coming out at about the same time that this game dropped. So I'm not sure if there's like a bit of influence going on there, but I love to say it. The premise for the game is also pretty wild, and similar to Beyond Good and Evil, deals with themes of capitalism and totalitarianism, and thematically is very Orwellian, which is so funny for a video game about rollerbladers. So basically, in Tokyo, there is this mega corporation that has infiltrated different levels of government and the police force, and they are implementing a regime to silence free speech. And all the while, they are usurping territory from the gangs around the city. And the gang that you play as, the GGs, have taken it upon themselves to rebel against the regime by using graffiti and expression. There's enough here thematically where you could write a dissertation on this game. At the time of its release, Jet Set Radio was critically acclaimed, and it received a 9.1 from IGN and holds an 88 out of 100 on Metacritic. It was also nominated by GameSpot for the best game that no one played on Xbox award, which is so oddly specific, and yet it still didn't win for this. But in the years since, the game has built like a really passionate and robust community. Like, I sort of stumbled into it a bit researching this video, but outside of this, the game has largely evaporated from the public gaming consciousness. That being said, the game has still had a profound influence. Like, for example, Sunset Overdrive. Now, is that a game that belongs on this Iceberg? Because that game slaps. And is anyone talking about it? It also inspired Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, which is essentially, and by design, a spiritual successor to Jet Set Radio Future. It takes all the same cues from the design, the gameplay, the characters, so much so that you could be tricked into thinking that this is the sequel to Jet Set Radio Future. And for a lot of fans, this is what they had been waiting for years and years and years. But here's the thing. The timing of this video is terrifying. So this year, we are getting 20th anniversary Beyond Good and Evil. We're getting Vampire Bloodlines 2. And as I started researching this, Jet Set Radio 3 was literally announced. Like, you can't make this up. The Operative No One Lives Forever is a spy-themed first-person shooter developed by Monolith Productions for the PC and released in 2000. In 2002, it would get a port for the PlayStation 2 and the Mac. However, the general consensus within the community is that the best way to experience this game is the PC version. Set against the backdrop of a stylized 1960s, the game follows Kate Archer, a female operative who works for a secret organization responsible for maintaining global peace. And in rendering its world and story, you can see the game pulling inspiration from many different places, but mainly 1960s spy-themed novels, movies such as James Bond and Derek Flint, and TV shows such as The Fugitive and The Prisoner. Tonally, the game is very campy, at times absurd, and some of the dialogue choices in this game are extraordinary. As you are exploring the world, you are bound to come across some amazing visual gags and Easter eggs that I would try to explain, but I'm just going to show you instead.
I've missed you terribly. Every moment I'm away from you is pure torture. How I've longed to take you in my arms and whisper words of love into your ear. Now, where's that damn socket wrench? How'd this goat get in here?
What do you mean? I don't want a monkey. Why not? Because I don't like monkeys. Now get that filthy beast away from me. Are you insulting my monkey? I'm sure it's a perfectly excellent monkey, but I don't want it. Now please leave. I'm very busy. $10. No, I wouldn't want the dreadful thing even if it were free. Free? You want my children to starve?
In terms of gameplay, it's a straightforward but very solid first-person shooter. And besides the usual firearms, Kate also has access to an arsenal of hidden gadgets and weapons disguised as women's accessories. These include explosive lipstick, perfume bottles full of sleeping gas, a belt that doubles as a zipline, and of course, beret lockpicks. And much like how James Bond has Q, Kate's weapons are provided by an inventor that goes by the name of Santa, and he builds them in his workshop. The game has a stealth mechanic and does provide players with multiple different ways to approach a mission, and while it is technically possible to do a full stealth playthrough, fans of the game generally agree that this would probably suck because the stealth mechanic is probably the weakest part of the game. Now, what sets this game apart is just the sheer scope of the story, the locations, and several missions that are just ahead of their time. And it really does try to give you the full James Bond experience as Kate globetrots from Germany to Morocco to the Alps to the Caribbean. Some of the standout missions include scuba diving a shipwreck, skydiving, and this next one, I'm sorry Tom Cruise, but Kate did it first. You fight villains in outer space. Upon its release, No One Lives Forever was met with an extraordinary amount of praise. It holds a 91 out of 100 on Metacritic. GameSpot praised its, quote, unrelenting inventiveness, gave it a 9.3 out of 10, and IGN called it, quote, one of the best shooters of the year, gave it a 9.1 out of 10, so nothing to scoff at. And all of this translated to numerous gaming awards, but once again, despite the praise, the game faced challenges commercially. No One Lives Forever had sold just over 36,000 copies by the end of 2000 and generated about $1.3 million in revenue. And by 2002, the game had sold 350,000 copies, which, while that sounds better, it's still not great. Nonetheless, the game would spawn a sequel in the form of No One Lives Forever 2, A Spy in Harm's Way, which was received really positively. Now today, the game is considered abandonware because there is just nowhere that you can legally download this game. Like, there's no Steam page, there's no nothing. In 2014, the game developer Night Dive Studios were super keen on remaking this game, and so they went down a ton of rabbit holes trying to figure out who has the rights to it. They eventually ended up getting told by Warner Brothers, who partially own the rights, that they were just not interested in licensing the game. But still, this game is a cult classic, and it has a very passionate fan base who continue to support the game. And so if you do look online for a download, Road Trip Adventure was released in 2002 for the PS2. And don't let the visuals fool you, because essentially what this game is an open world adventure RPG, but with cars. It's so cool. Like, yeah, there's no combat, but there is racing, and in so many other aspects, it's trying to emulate an RPG. You play as an anthropomorphic car in a large open world populated by other anthropomorphic vehicles. And if you bump into a car in the street, it'll start talking to you like an NPC, and it will have a name, and it'll be like, David. But the first thing that you might notice is the cartoony, childlike aesthetic, and that's because the designs of the cars in the game are based off of a toy car known as the Koro Cube, or sometimes referred to as penny racers. But these toys are super popular in Japan, and given that this game was originally intended for a Japanese market, it makes sense that they would tie it to a strong brand. Does anybody else remember Cartown from Facebook? It's sort of a similar aesthetic with these squished up cars, but I haven't thought of that game in years. An unintended consequence of this art style is that, graphically speaking, this game has aged remarkably well, especially considering that this game is over 20 years old. And if you bump the textures up to 4K using an emulator, this thing looks pristine. Let's talk about the map, because this thing is vast. It is much bigger than what you would expect for a game from 2002. Like, okay, yeah, through a modern lens, the spaces between the 9 major locations isn't as detailed. But still, there are Easter eggs no matter where you look on the map, whether that's in the form of buildings, NPCs, or these little photo booths that are scattered about the place, and you are completely unencumbered in the way that you want to go about exploring the world. And once you do reach one of the 9 locations, it's delightful. Like, they are all very visually distinct and unique from one another. For example, San Polis is based on Las Vegas, and it's in the middle of the desert, and it has casinos, and it has high rises, and it has that pyramid looking thing going on. Or there's Mushroom Road, which is tucked a bit more out of the way, but once you get there, all the houses and buildings, they look like big mushrooms. Or maybe the craziest one is Cloud Hill, which you get to by traveling up a rainbow and into the clouds. And the thing is that the game doesn't spoon feed you with markers on how to get to these locations, and you have to unlock them purely through exploration, which once again, the game does not get in your way of doing. There is nothing stopping you from booting up a new save game and then traveling to one of the later cities in the game. And then almost every building that has a door, you can go up to and you can go inside of. And that sense of freedom is fantastic. And it's one of the things that makes playing this game so relaxing and so joyful. The premise of the game is that you are trying to win enough races and sort of accumulate enough clout so that you can enter the World Grand Prix. Because at the start of the game, the president of this world of anthropomorphic cars, he sort of decided that he's tired with being the president and he wants to hang up the cape and cowl. And he declares that he will hand the presidency over to the winner of the World Grand Prix. And so that's the goal, to become the president. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not how democracy works. And as you're winning races and completing quests and meeting new cars, they will start to move into this town known as My City, which is essentially a city that you are responsible for building. At the start of the game, it's just this empty lot that's surrounded by 4 walls, but by the end of the game, there should be buildings everywhere and cars driving all about the place, and it's a really satisfying progression. Upon its release, this game did receive positive reviews. The US PlayStation Magazine described it as, quote, charming, deep, and astonishingly addictive. And GameSpy called it, quote, constant fun. But yeah, this game has pretty much completely flown under the radar. Like, there are not really people talking about it. So here's my weird suggestion. If you like Animal Crossing, try this game out, because it's just such a relaxing and open gaming experience. And I feel much the same way when I play this as I do when I play Animal Crossing. Tulip was released for the PS2 in Japan in 2002. It would get a release for the PS2 in North America, but that wouldn't be all the way until 2007, which was right at the end of the PS2's life cycle. And due to this stunted release, as well as several other reasons, this game wasn't very successful and has become largely forgotten to time. But for those who know, this game is a hidden gem, simply because it is so unique and so very, very strange. Firstly, this game is a fever dream. In every aspect, the characters, the story, the convoluted quest lines, it's off the rails. The premise of the game is that you are a young boy who's moved to this new town with his father. The game opens on this dream sequence that the young boy is having about himself and a girl. And at the end of the dream, they kiss. But then you are ripped back to reality when he wakes up and has to help his father unpack into the new house. And it's not long before you go about town and introduce yourself to the locals. And the characters in this game, like the designs and the concepts, are incredible. And as the young lad is going about town introducing himself, he bumps into the same girl that he dreamt about at the start of the game. And you were just so smitten that when you get home, you have to write her a love letter. And so you take your love letter and you place it in the mailbox. But then the mailbox speaks back to you and it tells you that it's terrible. It's a terrible love letter. Now, as weird as this game is, there are not talking mailboxes. And actually, this is the voice of Mr. Suzuki, who is a school teacher who lives in the sewer and can speak through, he's like speaking through the mailbox. I don't know what the logistics are. We're just gonna roll with it. And he demands you to come down into his sewer house. And so naturally, you do. And this is where you learn the main mechanic of the game, timed kissing, which after she emerges from the ground, you perform on a lady with an onion for a head. And from here on in, this is pretty much the game, where the main objective is to kiss most of the townsfolk, level up, and at the end of it, hopefully, end up with the girl of your dreams. The gameplay itself is mostly drawing from adventure games, but there are also elements of like simulation in there, and it's largely played from an isometric perspective as you're navigating the town of Long Life and boosting your standing with the residents. The puzzle-like element of landing successful kisses revolves around a day-night 24-hour cycle, where one of the requirements for a successful kiss is actually choosing the right time of day to attempt one. And there's like a bunch of other strange things that I could talk about with this game, but really, I just want to share some of these incredibly original characters by reading off of the wiki for this video game. So let's do that. First up, we have the always relatable 20-year-old guy. Potentially even more relatable. Agony Man Spider, of course. The Onion Lady, as previously described. Another vegetable-themed character, Eggplant Boy. Is that even allowed? And Mr. Frog, who we'll end on because he is such a wholesome-looking man. We are now at the final layer of this iceberg, the Sneak King layer. Let me level with you. This game is more of a masterpiece of advertising than it is a masterpiece of gaming, but stick with me because it's quite interesting. This game sold millions of copies, and I don't think anyone's thinking about this thing. This is a truly forgotten game. So in the process of making this video, I've sort of become inspired to like dust off my old Xbox and consider soft modding it. And if you don't know what soft modding is, among many different things it allows you to do, it also just allows you to have all of the games. And so I was watching a soft modding tutorial from Modville USA, and this guy's sort of like the GOAT of modding original Xboxes. And at the end of the video, after he sets up his entire library and he has to test it out using a game, he says this.
Let's boot up Sneak King, everybody's favorite game, and yeah, awesome.
And I'm like, what is Sneak King? Well, I researched it, and let me give you a brief explanation. So in 2006, Burger King released a promotional campaign in which they developed three video games, all starring the Burger King mascot as the playable character. These included Big Bumpin', Pocket Bike Racer, and of course, the magnum opus, Sneak King. And so during this promotional campaign, they would sell these video games along with value meals for the price of $3.99. So it's no surprise that they managed to sell millions of these bad boys. So this is a stealth game where you play as the Burger King mascot and you deliver Burger King meals to hungry NPCs. And the thing is that the way that they've done the animations and the stealth, the Burger King mascot comes across exceptionally creepy. And all of this sneaking around happens within 4 different levels. You've got the sawmill, the cul-de-sac, the construction zone, and downtown. And while these might just sound like generic levels, no, these are actually canonical to the Burger King extended universe. Each of these locations had been featured prominently in different Burger King commercials from the same period of time. And after this ad campaign had concluded with these video games, Burger King revenue was actually up, and some of the higher ups in the company attributed the success to this promotional ad campaign. And with that is the entire iceberg complete. Hi. Hopefully this cut isn't too jarring, but I just wanted to say that if you made it this far in the video, firstly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And then secondly, the stuff that I have planned for this channel, I'm super excited for. So if you do consider subscribing and sticking around, yeah, I'll see you in a month or so when the next video drops. And yeah, now I'm gonna go try to put back together the mess I made here with this Xbox. All right, see ya.